Well, in the meantime, do you think that we should just start with the intro idea that we had planned?
Let's go ahead and do the introductions because it's doing something. So we're just going to go around really quick. We'll do a few introductions. Say your name, what your organization is, and why. What has you interested in transportation lately? So my name is Brian Seal. I work for Baltimore City DOT. I'm the communications chair here with YPT, and I am really excited.
All right, he's frozen in time. So I'll just go next. My name is Brandy McCoy. Hopefully Brian joins us back. I am an environmental planner at KLT Group, and I am serving as this year's chair on the board.
I can go next. I'm Leah Vasakowitz. I am the deputy chair on the board, continuing on from last year and helping Brandy out. So let's go to Jade.
Hi, Jade Clayton, outgoing chair of YPT Baltimore and now vice chair of administration. Pass it off to Megan.
Hi, my name is Megan Duckett. I am the new vice chair of partnerships for YPT. This will be my first time on the board.
There we go.
I think I'm the last board member of YPT, so I can go. I'm Craig Stevenhofer, transit planner / engineer with Kimley Horn, and I am the treasury chair, vice chair of YPT Baltimore. I see Jaren's on the call too, so I missed your picture there. So Jaren's also on our board, so you can go next.
Yep, good evening. My name is Jaren Williams. I'm the vice chair of programs. I'm currently with Baltimore City Public Schools, Office of Transportation. Yeah.
All right. So we're going to do some shout outs to some of our sponsors. But first, I'm going to hand it off to Brandy. Brandy McCoy is our chair, and she works for KPT doing environmental justice. Brandy, take it away.
All right, thank you. So as Brian mentioned, and we did our introductions, I am new to the board this year, and it's been a fun experience so far. The group is very welcoming, so moving forward, I encourage people to get involved. But I would like to say this afternoon, Brian mentioned that there are 68 people signed up, and that's a huge number. And it shows, I think, the enthusiasm that this network has and this chapter has for wanting to engage and hear about the latest legislative priorities. And also because of our panelists and speakers that are attending tonight, I think that shows the excitement that this event brought. So thank you everyone here for participating and showing up for this event. I just want to say just a few words about the history of YPT Baltimore. It's, as a new person coming in from attending events, you get more information and some fun facts. So I'll share a little bit about YPT Baltimore. In 2013, it started as the Professional Association of Young Transportationists. And then in 2015, it became a full-fledged chapter established as the Baltimore chapter. And that was geared at connecting, our networks to that higher international network and amongst other networks across the country and some in Canada. So, this year, YPT International, they're looking to establish and strengthen their support for our local networks. During this time, they've offered the board members some opportunities to sit in for listening sessions. And, being transparent and communicating with our network, we'll share the information that comes out of that. And if there are opportunities for members to be involved and provide input, I feel like the board would support having that input from our members and our local network. And I would say, moving forward, COVID is definitely keeping us from being in person. It's not a fun fact, but I'm not a beer fan. Not sure if that's cool to say here, but I do enjoy going to events with everyone. And so I missed that connection of meeting people in person, and it kind of spurred me to join YPT in this role and getting encouragement to participate behind the scenes, you go from attending events to helping plan and support the network. I wanted to take the opportunity to do that. But I think tonight it shows like people are wanting to engage. So, we'll do this virtual thing and we'll keep doing it well and having events moving forward. We have great, happy hours planned. We have ideas for fostering continuing education for your professional licenses. We want to support information sharing amongst this group. If there's job opportunities out there, if there are networking events, if you hear of any events, share the information with us. This organization, at least when I think of welcoming and the welcome that I've received from others here, is that this organization is ours, and we want to make sure that this platform is useful to people. So if you have ideas, please feel free to share them with us. If there's needs of this chapter during this time, for sure, please communicate that with us and we'll be sure to take that on. I guess, before we turn it over to speakers, I hope I'm not running too late on time. We do have sponsors that we like to thank. You can see them uploaded on the screen. Thank you, Megan, for putting that together. You can see there are some partners and sponsors that are here to continuing to support us. So I would like to provide opportunity if there are any of those sponsors here representing their organization, if they'd like to say hi, say their name, and if you feel like highlighting any of your initiatives that are going on with your organization, you have some time to do that now. Nope.
Hi, my name is Lakeisha Henderson. I'm with Bike and Brunch Tours. I'm really looking forward to the information at this event. I think you mentioned the lead off during the introductions to mention something that we were really excited about in the world of transportation. And I'm definitely curious to see what Secretary Buttigieg is going to do, especially I know there's a lot of conversation, especially in this region as it relates to rail. And I know that he has mentioned quite a few things that have been echoed here, and not just related to rail or automotive transportation, but also as it relates to just complete streets and more integrated multimodal transit. So, but about Bike and Brunch Tours, Bike and Brunch Tours is a bicycle tour that is focused on the history, culture, and legacy of historically Black communities. We are based in Baltimore. We have tours, multiple different tours now in Baltimore, but we also have tours in Richmond, Virginia, Charlotte, and are exploring other cities even during this time. So if you in your organization or even just you and your friends are actually getting out now to do outdoor, socially distanced small group activities, we do host private tours even though we're off season. And we comply with the CDC protocols, have various different layers of precaution that we take. And that includes as well the brunch the brunch experience. And if you have questions, you can ask, and we can also accommodate that. And in addition to those different options, we are moving and changing how we meet. So if you're an organization or corporation that is looking for a way to do some team building or get your team in person during these times, that's something that we also look forward to facilitating even before our season starts. Our season starts in April, runs until October. For those who are thinking about gifting it or aren't sure about the dates because of COVID, we do have gift cards that we sell online as well as at the Lewis Museum. And we also have bicycle rentals for those who don't have bicycles. And you can find us online at bikeandbrunchtours.com and on all social media channels under that. Thank you for the opportunity to share.
Thank you. Anyone else on the call would like to hop in? I also love your logo, Lakeisha. That's nice.
Thank you. And that's actually our alternative logo, but thank you.
Okay. All right. Anyone else want to jump in? All right. So I guess, that's perfect timing. So, but thank you to all our sponsors that are, continually supporting us. I would like to turn it over to Brian. Brian's going to be moderating our panel as well. So in addition to being communications, he's going to be moderating this panel with questions and kicking off the panel session.
All right. Thank you very much. So the way we're going to do this, we're going to start by talking to Liz and Dr. Chavis. We're gonna open up with that. We're then going to move on to Brian O'Malley and Eric Norton. I just realized we misspelled Brian's name in the email. And talk a little bit about some of the stuff that's going on in the MGA. Brian is also a member of the transition team. So then we'll kind of open up to general questions. If you do have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat, or we can unmute you. We'll be going to about 7:15 for this, and then we'll kind of move on to more of a social happy hour, kind of more of a chatting, just more of a social thing. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Celeste Chavis. She is the Associate Professor at Morgan State University in the Department of Transportation and Urban Infrastructure Studies. Her recent projects include multimodal transportation network modeling and the deployment of electric vehicle infrastructure, as well as her work on the Transition Committee as co-chair with Liz Cornish, who is the other co-chair. She is also the Executive Director of Baltimore. She is a longtime bike commuter who came to bicycle advocacy because she believes that bikes are tools for creating vibrant communities that connect citizens to recreation, jobs, and others. So first off, thank you guys both very much for your time. This is a very timely discussion because the transition report came out just today, just at about 7 hours ago. So this is all very fresh. So before we talk about the actual content, can you talk about what exactly is the Transition Committee? What is this transition report? Like why were you chosen and the rest of the team chosen to do this work?
Can I hop in with a point of order? How long do we have?
This is a little bit flexible. We're going to start with about 10 minutes, kind of introducing some of the Transition Committee stuff, but we have plenty of questions. So okay. if we're having great discussion, we can keep going.
Okay, great. I want to make sure that we have plenty of time for Brian and Eric and then questions for us too. Dr. Chavis, do you want to start out?
Sure, I can start off. So the committee was arranged, we had co-chairs, which was myself and Liz. People were able to apply online to be part of the transition committees, as well as the mayor recommended people, and so did Liz and I. But we were tasked essentially with providing the vision for Mayor Scott's first term in office. We were asked to break down our recommendations by 100 days, 1 year, and then his first term, so 4 years. And most importantly, they had to be things that the mayor's office could tackle and that they could be implementable within that first term. Liz, anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, so I also served on Mayor Pugh's transition team as well. And so it was really interesting for me to compare and contrast, and then also to be in the role of co-chair, which was different than the first time. And I think, first of all, it was a huge honor to be asked to do this. And I was very impressed by the co-chairs that Mayor Scott and his team selected. It was very different, I think, than past transition teams, especially in terms of what I would describe as power dynamics. And so often these things are chaired by, I don't know, people with wealth and power. And so when you look at the co-chairs of all the committees, you'll see this really interesting balance. So you'll see a balance, a diversity of age, race, where people are at in their career, so what sort of constituency they represent. And so that is also what we really looked at when we were forming our committee. And we just wanted to make sure that not only was there sort of diversity of thought, but there was also diversity of power. You know, like you have to think about that when you're talking about who has access to somebody like the mayor and who has access to start making these recommendations. And so we were really intentional to make sure that our committee reflected that. And we really reached out to our network. So it wasn't just Celeste and I, you know, sitting not in a room because we don't do that anymore, but it wasn't Celeste and I. So, you know, the mayor did recommend probably, I would say about like half of the committee that we could discuss and sort of, you know, push back on or make recommendations. And then we got to pick the other half. And we really reached out to a broad network of people to get recommendations. And so I was really excited to spend time with people. And these were folks that just came with such amazing ideas. And just a little bit about structure. It was very different than the first time. There were some similarities, but also different since we had to meet virtually. The whole process lasted about 12 weeks.
Yeah.
A little bit of time, like, you know, a while. And we met weekly. We tried to balance the meetings with inviting speakers to discuss a specific topic. And then the committee itself formed subcommittees. They also invited people to speak on different areas that they were looking at and exploring in more detail. And then we all came together to draft our final report. And then that report then went to the administration with feedback. We got it again. We then presented to the entire committee of co-chairs and the mayor, and then it was done, and then it was really in their hands. And then the thing about the process that was very different than the first time I did it was the involvement of the mayor. He was incredibly hands-on. We had multiple meetings on Sundays that went from 9 to like noon or 1 p.m.
Yeah.
He was on the whole time, and we were talking all together and collaborating across committees. And so that was very different and I think very encouraging. So this is not just a plan that's going to sit on a shelf. This is stuff that he really, you know, he had a say in and what kind of ended up in the final product in the whole process. So that was sort of how it worked.
Yeah. So if for anybody who hasn't seen the report yet, it's broken down into the first 100 days for some of the priorities, and then first term. Can you guys talk about some of the priorities that you think are more interesting and kind of some of the background of how you chose what were the first 100 days ones, especially as we're about 60 days into the term?
Sure. So each of our subcommittees came up with recommendations, and then we asked them to kind of put them in where they thought it would be best in terms of time frame. The mayor's office changed some of them as well. They also reviewed and looked at their priorities to see what they thought would be feasible given their list of priorities. One of the things for me that really stuck out was there were so many conversations with the people we invited from the various agencies, and some of those were Public Works, Department of Transportation, MTA, as well as we invited an outside person from Charleston to provide some framing in terms of how do you apply equity from a person who's actually working and leading a transit agency, a transportation agency. And so one of the things that really stuck out was the need for coordination amongst the different agencies. And so all of our various subcommittees mentioned that, as did a lot of the speakers who came to talk with us. And so a big part of what we did was just making sure that we're leveraging the resources that we have in the city and using everything efficiently and effectively. And Liz, you can.
Yeah, and I think like number one, when you're looking at it, and everything that people were saying was collaboration across, there's the businessy term, there's a lot of siloing that happens among city agencies. And I think it was really evident that, there's so many different people and agencies within the city that touch the streets. And you have to figure out how to coordinate all of those folks, particularly to maximize resources. And we see this all the time, right?
DOT will come and put in an amazing project, and they'll restripe, and maybe they'll even put in a curb. And then 3 weeks later, BG&E comes in and digs it up. And I think that to recognize that that is something that frustrates people within agencies as well, right? And so this is not just incompetence across the board. These are systems that ultimately have to be coordinated from the top, and they have to come from the mayor's office, and agency heads need to be directed to do this work. Otherwise, they're going to do the best that they can. They're going to make mistakes. And so that, I think, was a huge takeaway. The other thing, and it's not really transportation related, but I think it sort of spoke to some of the things that I took away from this, is we were transportation and infrastructure. And so this idea of what does infrastructure mean? And I think it's something that transportation professionals have to consider as well, particularly when we're talking about funding and compressed resources. And so one of the cool things that I didn't know a whole lot about was digital equity. And so we looked at it from an infrastructure perspective. So what are we doing with the fiber optic networks? And that does have to do with what's happening underneath a street. And so that is something that as transportation professionals, you do want to be thinking about the future, and you do want to be thinking about equity. And so when you do cut open that street, what is there an opportunity to do? Because if you're talking about digital equity, which I would say is sort of a newer advocacy issue that may not have a lot of power behind it, wouldn't that be amazing if we could bring all of the transportation people together that then understand street cuts, that then understand what's happening underneath the street, and then they're collaborating and working together. And so they're saying, well, if we're already doing this project, what else can we do? Who else can we bring into the conversation? What can we fix while we're there? So I think that that was something that was really great. And then I think the other part was, you know, we had, like, if you go through it, I would say we talked about what I think like are newer ideas that cities are incorporating that are, we're not necessarily talking about 5 and 10 year long capital projects. We're talking about quick build teams. So much of our traffic calming, they don't have enough engineers within the Department of Transportation right now. So we contract out a ton. That increases cost, and that certainly delays the timeline. You know, we don't need an engineering stamp on a couple of flex posts and some paint to do some traffic calming on a corridor. Okay, we can do it. And if it doesn't work, we can take it out. And so that was one of the things that we really promoted, was talking about, like, let's just do some of this stuff. It doesn't have to cost a lot of money. We can go ahead and just do it. And then the other thing that I thought was really interesting and something to keep in mind is that we have a mayor that's young. We have a mayor that's younger than me. And it's so often when we're talking about progressive transportation issues, when you're talking to decision makers, you're having to teach up, right? You have to spend a lot of time teaching that director or that mayor, what do you mean when you say quick build? What do you mean when you say bus priority, you know, traffic signal priority? What does that mean? Mayor Scott gets it. Like, you can talk to him briefly. He will go read about it. He has had experience working with nationwide coalitions of elected officials. So we're like light years ahead because of what Mayor Scott already knows and internalizes and is open to learning more about than we ever have been. And so that was another thing that I really took away from this stuff, is he would, you know, I would say, and he was like, well, have you thought about this? And I was like, okay, yeah, I will now. And so,
yeah, and we should probably mention that there was a legislation team already set up devoted to transportation legislation before the transition team was created. So transportation has kind of already been on his radar before this transition committee was even created.
Yeah. Well, that's all I'll say about that. So we'll stop.
That's awesome. So I want to bring in our other two panelists. We have Brian O'Malley, who is the president and CEO of Central Maryland Transportation Alliance. He joined the CMTA in 2008, coming from Carroll County. We also have Eric Norton, who's the director of policy and programs, also with CMTA. He joined the Transportation Alliance in 2014, coming from Los Angeles. So we wanted to bring you guys in to talk a little bit about the legislative side. Brian O'Malley is also a member of the transition team. So there's a lot we can cover on this. There's a lot of meat on this bone. But let's start with everything that's going on with the Maryland General Assembly, where there is a flurry of bills being discussed around transportation. There's been a lot of high-level support for transportation, the Transportation Safety and Investment Act, from politicians and activist groups, including the CMTA and Bike More. What happened this year that brought about all this support for funding for transportation?
That's a great question, Brian. I just wanted to say too, it's great to see some familiar faces and names on here. So hello to everyone. I wish we were doing this in person, but this is the next best thing. And a shout out to Eric, a colleague of Eric's and mine, Danielle Sweeney is also listening in. So the question about how did this coalition come together? You know, it goes back, there's a few sort of root causes to it. I think one is that there's been a growing sense that we need to do something about public transportation for a few years. And specifically this bill, the Transit Safety and Investment Act, was introduced in the 2020 session, passed the House with a bipartisan vote, but didn't get a vote in the Senate. And that sort of established it and gave advocates something to focus on coming back for the 2021 session. Another thing that happened was the pandemic. And that really, you know, as people like to say, or often say about the pandemic, is that it laid bare some things that were happening in society and helped us see them. And one of those was that transit is essential. And what I mean by that is that ridership went down on transit, but it did not go away. There are people who continue to rely on it. And what we learned was before the pandemic in Maryland, 35% of transit commuters worked in essential jobs. And we don't have the statistic yet, but I can guarantee you that a much higher percentage of transit riders now work in essential jobs. And we saw that transit ridership in Baltimore fell, but it only fell by about 50%. And people are continuing to rely on it, to especially the local bus service, to get to jobs at hospitals, food distribution, and other things. But it also put transit in a crisis. And so advocates had to get busy to try to save transit. And there were efforts on the federal level to get federal aid in the CARES Act and the December COVID relief package for public transportation. But there were also battles here in Maryland. And in particular, on September 1st, MDOT announced budget cuts. And as part of that, MTA was proposing to cut the local bus service, eliminating 25 routes that would have been permanent. It would have also reduced the footprint of areas that are eligible for the paratransit service. And advocates came together and said, this is the wrong way to do this. This will hurt the people who are most vulnerable and most dependent on the service right now. And so by the end of September, MTA had reversed its plans and instead made deeper cuts to the MARC commuter train and MTA commuter bus service, which have seen ridership fall by about 95%. So at least during the pandemic, fewer people are impacted. And those cuts are not permanent. So that brought a lot of new partners to the advocacy effort. And when that result happened at the end of September, they said, we want to address the capital needs, and that's the Transit Safety and Investment Act. And so we want to make sure that the MTA has the funding it needs to address deferred maintenance and breakdown issues that it's dealing with. And so that helped bring some new partners to the table. And so we have an even bigger coalition around the bill this year than we did a year ago. And I think Eric can drop in the chat for you a take action opportunity if you're interested in supporting the Transit Safety and Investment Act. This is exactly the right time to do it. You can send an email to your elected officials using a tool that he'll post in there. There it is. So savemdtransit.org. And that'll allow you to chip in and help with this broad coalition that's trying to get this bill over the finish line. By chip in, I don't mean money. I mean sending an email. Sorry. It'll allow you to lend a hand. That's a better term. It'll allow you to lend a hand.
I'll take your money.
Yeah.
There's nothing better than free. So you've talked about the Transit Safety and Investment Act, but there are many transportation priorities in the MGA this year, including expanded rail projects, bus lane enforcement, changes to the crash data reporting, and complete streets funding. What are some of the legislation that you're tracking this year?
Great. Eric, do you want to flag that, and then maybe I can say a little bit more about the bus lane enforcement, but do you want to give a couple highlights of things that we're keeping an eye on?
Sure. Yeah, I'd say, yeah, the big one we're watching is the Transit Safety and Investment Act, obviously. I wanted to actually, before going on to a few other things, I wanted to add one thing to what Brian said about like the coalition that's come together for that bill. It's even pre-pandemic, the other sort of major crisis facing humanity being climate change. You know, it started come to the fore a little more, and the environmental community has really come around to realizing that electric cars aren't the end all be all, and that expanding transit has to be part of the solution if we're going to actually address climate change. Starting probably like maybe 3 years ago, the environmental groups like League of Conservation Voters and Sierra Club really started joining forces with us and providing a lot of, you know, they have a lot of big grassroots networks that they're able to bring to bear on this. So I just wanted to give them a shout out as well, and why I think this coalition is one of the reasons this coalition's come together. Other things we're looking at legislatively, there's always a lot going on in the General Assembly, and it's hard to kind of keep your eye on a lot of the balls, but we do the best we can. One of the things, speaking of like electrification, one thing we're watching is zero emission buses. There's a bill to require MTA to start transitioning their fleet, their bus fleet, to zero emission vehicles. Right now, none of the buses are zero emission. I think they're testing some, but nothing in regular revenue service. MTA has already made goals of starting to transition to zero emission vehicles as part of the regional transit plan that they completed last fall. But this would, there's a legislative effort that this has bubbled up the last few years to sort of put some teeth in it by making it state law that they have to every time, when starting in 2025, when they start purchasing the replacement buses, that they would have to be zero emission vehicles. So that's one we're watching. Also related, I guess, to buses is the bus lane bill and enforcing the bus lanes that Brian Seal mentioned. Brian O'Malley, do you want to talk more in detail about the bus lane bill?
Yeah, Brian, is that okay if I take a minute or two to talk about that bill?
Sure.
So for those, probably most of you are aware, bus lanes give priority to buses. So it speeds up travel times for bus riders where roads are congested with other traffic, and increases reliability of buses. And travel time and reliability are two key factors in growing ridership. Baltimore City right now contains just shy of 6 miles of dedicated bus lanes. These are serviced by some of the MTA's high frequency bus lines, and they transport hundreds of thousands of residents every day to places like work, school, and errands, and so forth. The regional transit plan that was released in October by the MTA has a target to install an additional 12 miles of dedicated bus lanes in the greater Baltimore region by 2025. One project under construction now, the North Avenue Rising project, which is partly funded by a Tiger grant from the U.S. Department of Transportation, will install 7 miles of dedicated bus lanes towards that goal. And that's all great, but the problem is they only work when they're clear. And anyone who's kept an eye on them sees that often cars and trucks use them to stop or park. And then the bus is forced to hit the brakes, put the blinker on, and try to merge into the congested traffic that it's supposed to be avoiding, making the drivers unhappy and the bus passengers unhappy. In fact, the Transportation Alliance, we did field observations with volunteers and found that any given block of bus lane has a parked car in it 25% of the time. Or if you think of 4 straight blocks, a bus can never go 4 straight blocks clear without running into having to go around a parked car or truck. So the solution is public education and enforcement. And Delegate Robin Lewis has a bill, House Bill 284, which would provide local jurisdictions the authority to install and manage automated bus lane monitoring cameras. And that's the result of a work group that she required a couple years ago with both MTA and the city government. But it would provide the authorization for any jurisdiction in Maryland to put it in place. So for example, Montgomery County has been looking at implementing bus lanes and might be interested. So that's House Bill 284.
Excellent. That actually kind of brings a good question. I'd like to bring everybody back in on this one. One of the priorities in the transition report was about putting cameras on the circulator. I believe that Robin Lewis has said that some of the pushback about cameras on the buses has been finding the funding and various issues with various technical issues with the MTA putting cameras on their buses. But one of the recommendations was around putting cameras on the circulator buses. Can somebody talk about that recommendation and how that fits in with this larger state law, or the law that's going through the MGA right now?
I'll hop in because I think I probably have the least technical answer. And so if people want to know a little bit more about the logistics about how that might work, I'm sure Celeste or Brian can probably explain that better. But I would say that the theme is on this stuff is there are solutions, and the city has a lot more authority to deal with some of this stuff than they actually ever wield. And so a lot of the theme or in the transition report was do the most that you can with what we have. And so I think in terms of funding, there are ways to examine where is funding for the circulator coming from? What are some of the different ways that we can look at diversifying revenue streams? And then it becomes less of a cost issue and more of an investment in this versus this other thing, right? And so it's like, what are we consolidating? What are we getting rid of in order to do this one thing? And so in terms of bus cameras on the circulator, it's necessary, it's effective. And so why not? And so I think like the prohibitive part will be cost if it doesn't move forward. But in terms of political will or any of those sorts of things, like I think it's well within the range of possibilities. And I think we finally have a mayor that is open to taking advantage of the locus of control that the city does have in some of those stuff. Because we do know some of it is out of our hands and in the hands of the state.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have much to add to that. I think a big part of, particularly when we were discussing transit, was just trying to think of things that the city can tackle that doesn't require state buy-in necessarily. And so that's one of the things that came to our attention. And also when we spoke to Baltimore City Public Schools, they've been interested in being able to equip their buses with cameras. So at least having the circulator as like a first trial can open up other opportunities too.
Excellent. Thank you guys very much. I did want to call out one comment that we got in the chat from Barbara Zektik. I probably butchered that, saying that the Senate, there's a Senate voting session on the Transit Safety and Investment Act, and that it's being held up by issues with how it's going to be paid for. But moving on, Brandon Scott secured the Democratic nomination a week after the death of George Floyd, possibly with the help of some people who were excited about his platform around Baltimore's inequitable outcomes for different parts of the city. What are some of the issues around equity that the transition team is looking at? And what do you think are some of the most pressing issues that Baltimore needs to deal with?
Some of the things that we talked about around equity was one, where we're implementing projects. So in particular, when we were discussing like the traffic calming quick build teams, we emphasize certain areas that are kind of outside the central or the colloquially known white L part of Baltimore. So that was something that we explicitly discussed within our committee. We were also focused on ADA access, particularly around bus stops. We felt that was one of those low-hanging, high-reward things that we could implement. So those were two of the things that got the most attention, but we actually started our whole committee process by framing it around public health and equity. And so we made sure that that was at the forefront of most of our discussion.
Yeah, I think what's interesting when you look at Mayor Scott's 100-day thing that he wants to tackle, he breaks it into categories as well. And under equity, that's where the Baltimore Greenway Trail Network is. You know, so I think a lot about the report that came out in terms of economic impact, and people have a lot to say about what the trail can and can't do. But I think in terms of where Mayor Scott looks at some of these infrastructure projects, he looks at connectivity. And so he talks about how do you get from one part of the city to the other, and how are we increasing access to opportunity? And so one of the other things that we discussed is how do you realign the circulator? It doesn't work. Like the way that it was intended to operate, it got so far away from that mission. And then now we're starting to see it as the free bus. Why don't some other neighborhoods have access to the free bus? Well, a circulator is supposed to do X, Y, and Z thing. It's not supposed to be this huge transit connectivity tool, but it's what we have. So we know we're not using it to fully circulate people very well. It's unreliable. The frequency isn't there the way that it was when it was first initiated. We know that politics influence it, and all of a sudden it can go all the way up to Hopkins or to university now, and didn't before. And that was political on one of the most well-resourced public transit routes anyway. So MTA works really well on Charles Street in St. Paul. Like, why do you need the circulator to go up that far? And so then we talked about how do you take the asset that are these city-owned buses and these resources from things like parking garages and put it where we're really challenged with first and last mile connectivity. So we're talking about Mondawmin, right? Mondawmin is this amazing transit hub where you can get a lot of different modes of transit and then connect to other parts of the city, but getting there is an issue. And so what do you think about realigning the circulator resources and putting them next to one of those transit hubs? So that was one of the ideas as well in terms of incorporating equity. But I do want to say to Celeste is that, or to echo what Celeste said, that equity cannot be in anything that we're doing in the city. It cannot be another box to check or its own program. It has to inform all of the different things that you're doing. And so particularly Mayor Scott's legislation around equity in all policies and creating a fund to provide resources to get equity or to provide equity in all policies that is happening in the city. That's why we had Keith Benjamin, who's the director of transportation in Charleston, and we had Dr. Keisha Pollock Porter from Hopkins setting the course and saying, like, this is the framework at which you have to really decide when you're talking about what should happen. Does it create equity or not? And if it doesn't, it's not the right solution.
Excellent. Moving on to the city council, the new city council president, Nick Mosby, removed the committee structure that the previous city council president, Brandon Scott, had installed and put in committee chairs that had historically been less friendly to changes in our transportation system. What things are you excited about with this new city council, and what has you worried?
I mean, I've talked a lot, so I don't know if other folks want to jump in, but city council is also Bike Moore's wheelhouse. So We were pissed when the committee assignments came out and when they actually removed the Transportation and Land Use Committee. I think that was it was a mistake. And I think I understand the reasoning behind trying to consolidate committees. I think politically the committee process has been very poor. I think the council president position is really holding the city back from passing critical legislation. And so that is even political. Like if something goes to committee, the council president has to sign off on it. And now he has decided how to change the committees, and then he has put people in leadership that have not proven themselves to be legislators. And so now we're worried that where do transportation and land use legislation go? It's going to end up in all different committees, depending on where the council president decides to assign it. There won't be cohesion in terms of an overarching plan. It'll be very difficult for city council people to co-sponsor and then wonder what committee it's going to end up in. That said, the council that we have now, when you think about where we were 4 years ago and who we were electing and what they cared about, more people on council care and understand transportation and land use issues than they did 4 years ago. So we have a bigger bench than we certainly did 4 years ago. And I think that is something to be celebrated. And we also have support from folks like Bill Henry in the comptroller's office. So you're talking about how do these transportation projects actually happen? Well, the contracts have to be approved by the Board of Estimates. And so now, even if Council President Mosby may not prioritize these issues, we have a mayor and a comptroller who do and who understand it. So that really does change the political dynamic on the Board of Estimates. So I think overall the legislative process will be more difficult, but I do think we have a bigger bench.
All right. So COVID has changed how we're doing community outreach. Nothing shows it better than how we're doing this right now. Like normally our warm and informed type get-togethers would be at like a brewery or someplace that we can all get together and kind of have that opening conversation, and then have a panel, and then everybody just kind of hang out and chat. But it's really changed how outreach, advocacy, and even testimony has been done in the Maryland General Assembly and with the city. Given the fact that not everyone has reliable access to the internet, how do you think that the government should change how it interacts with citizens between pre-pandemic and post-pandemic life?
I'll jump in on that one. I'll jump in because as a advocacy organization, and I think Bikemore does this a lot too, we work with citizens who we try to help be a bridge to help citizens testify, speak up, share their story. And there's some technology platform challenges, but there's also some real advantage to allowing people to participate in a hearing without having to get to a physical location. It opens up possibilities. So I hope they don't completely revert to the way things were done before. Having these virtual opportunities make government more accessible to people who want to be present and speak their part.
And I think the one thing that I saw that didn't work very well that I hope people figure out is that there's a lot of digital tools that people are getting comfortable with if they have internet access. But I went to a community meeting a couple weeks ago, and the consultant was trying to do like breakout rooms and things, and like older residents that are very engaged and deserve to be heard. Some of them were calling in like, what do you do then? Or they're just not as comfortable with technology. So like, are they pressing the right button to get in the room? Are they moving? They used the Post-it note thing, Celeste. So like, I can't use the Post-it note thing. So like, how are we gonna? So I would say that like we've got to find a balance too. Like we can't just chase the new shiny thing and expect other people to catch up. So there has to be, I think virtual meetings and having that as an option is critical. I'm on the board of the CVCA and or Charles Village Civic Association, and we've talked about keeping it, right? And most of the people on the board are older. And they were like, this is great. More people come to our meetings than ever. So I think that part is good, but I do think that if, you know, and folks on this call are consultants as well, don't chase the new shiny thing, like get really invested in how you're going to bring people in, and don't expect people to be able to understand some of these newer technology tools.
Yeah, and I would just say it can be a positive, particularly when it comes to people whose transportation challenges may prohibit them from coming to some of these public meetings. But just from like an instructor standpoint, I think some of the challenges are just the variety of tools that people are suddenly faced with. Like even at our university, like I had to tell like the School of Engineering, like we're using Zoom, don't use anything else. Like this is too much for our students. And so I think we have to be conscientious of just how many different things are out there and how overwhelming it can be. But there definitely can be some benefit to virtual with other options.
Thank you, guys. And remember to everybody, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat. This is much harder to have as a really engaging discussion as we would have in real life. But one of the questions we did get was from Barbara around the transit funding, and Eric wanted to talk a little bit more about that. So can you talk more about the funding around the Transit Safety and Investment Act?
Sure, yeah. I just wanted to, Barbara raised a great point about the chair of the Senate Budget and Taxation Committee asking where the revenues will come from. And just if folks were wondering, and to clarify that, the Transit Safety Investment Act, it would be funded through the Transportation Trust Fund, which is how MDOT funds all its projects within the Transportation Trust Fund, and it's separate from the general fund. And so it wouldn't, the way the bill's written, you wouldn't need to raise new revenues to fund it. The General Assembly could always, raise the gas tax or do a vehicle mile travel tax or come up with any other fee they want to fill up the trust fund. But they don't have to. The way it's written is it would really require MDOT to reprioritize its existing budget. So it would sort of get them to sort of adopt a fix it first approach and prioritize maintenance of our existing system before it goes expanding the current system. And just as far as like their ability to do that, sometimes you hear pushback, well, that would mean like canceling some projects or something, and taking away from someone else to pay for this. Folks on this call probably follow the purple line pretty closely, and we're watching that project as it the private partner kind of pulled out and they went to court and it became a whole thing, and MDOT, the state, ended up having to settle that, and to get out of it agree to pay the private contractor $250 million, and within about a month MDOT was able to come up with $100 million to pay that private contractor that first chunk of money. And when the General Assembly asked them, well, what projects did you cancel to come up with $100 million? They said, oh no, we didn't cancel anything. We were able to, we had some revenues that came in higher than we expected. We moved some cash flow around and we were able to do it. So the money for the Transit Safety Investment Act over the next 6 years averages out to sort of redirecting about $90 million a year. So we figure, with a few years notice, they can figure out how to find $90 million if they can come up with $100 million in a month. So I hope that addresses some of the revenue questions.
Hi, this is Barbara Zektik. Hi, Eric. Hi, Brian. Just to add some context of what happened at the voting session today, I just thought it was interesting because I hadn't heard anything like this for a while, frankly. But after they did their conversation about roads versus transit, as they always do, and splitting the Transportation Trust Fund, yada, yada, it was then that Senator Young got up and he said, we should really think about how to increase the whole pool of Transportation Trust Fund dollars when, the gas tax is going to be irrelevant in 5 to 10 years. And that's when Chair Gazzoni got up and he said, we're going to have time later this session. We're almost done with the COVID Relief Act. We're getting all these bills done quickly. We're going to be focusing on transportation revenues and getting more money into the trust fund. And that's when it was like, so we're going to hold this for now because this is going to be a larger conversation. I mean, I had not heard anyone talking about increasing transportation revenues since we talked about the gas tax a million years ago, right? So that was the context, and that's what I wanted to make sure it was clear. I don't think he's postponing passing the bill. I don't think he's opposed to the bill. In fact, I think he's trying to help us get more money in the TTF.
Cool, thanks for that. That's, yeah, I don't think we'd heard that yet.
Right?
More money.
EMT tax time, guys.
So a question from Russ Anderson. I'm gonna have to, I don't know some of these acronyms, but it says CMTA and the Greater Washington Partnership were the only two public comments in the latest UPWP. Do you feel that they did adequate public outreach? And what is the UPWP?
You want me to do that one, Brian?
Yeah, go for it.
I'll try and do it quick. BMC is the Baltimore Metropolitan Council, which is like the sister organization of the Baltimore Regional Transportation Board, which is the Baltimore Region's Metropolitan Planning Organization, which is this federally required multi-jurisdictional organization where if you want to draw down federal funds for transportation, you have to create one of these metropolitan planning organizations. So the UPWP refers to the Unified Planning Work Program, which is like what the projects the BMC is going to work through for the next year or two. I think they're 2-year plans. So I think Russ's question was like, if you followed any of what I just said, congratulations. Most people have no idea what that means. And I think that gets to Russ's question is like, why would anyone comment on these plans when you have no idea what they are, what they do, who's in charge, how the funds are being used, is it effective? Will you see it show up in your everyday? So that's a big question. I used to be on the public advisory committee for the Baltimore Regional Transportation Board for a few years. And even after all that, that time, it was still a struggle to figure out like, what are we doing here? And a lot of that is, because most of the decision-making power lies in this state with either the state in the Department of Transportation or the local governments either in the city or the county, and sort of these regional style governments where it's multiple jurisdictions trying to come together don't really have a ton of power and decision-making authority. So that's probably also a reason why not a ton of outreach or engagement, because people might not feel like it's really worth their time and effort when they could be engaging on other things.
Excellent. Thanks, Eric. We also got another really good question in the chat from Ethan Hasek. I see in the transition report the mention of a bus priority team, which I'm really excited about. Which organizations or agencies would contribute to members to such a committee? Would it be more like the Mayor's Bicycle Advisory Commission, the Curbside Management Group, or another model that you have in mind?
I geeked out and typed my answer, but and then like we're really used to doing this because we're on panels a lot. Like Brian's really good at answering in the chat, so I'm trying to follow his good example. So
this is also recorded, so we want to make sure we capture all the responses.
Yeah. So bus priority team, and I think each, Dr. Chavis, Eric, and Brian, please feel free to jump in. I'll keep mine really short, but it's intended to be housed within Baltimore City Department of Transportation. So new positions. I think one of the things that we really ask for, and I think I want to let people know already underway, is to hire more people to work on complete streets, and especially engineers. And I think Director Sharkey understands very clearly that we need more people inside of the department looking at this stuff, not as like a one-off project or, sort of like a fun idea, but this is their job. And when the red line got canceled, the transit division really fell apart within the department and it never got built back up. And even then it was pretty anemic. So a bus priority team would be just that. That's their job. You got engineers, you got planners, and you got people that are focused on making the bus work better. And so that can mean a whole host of things. But the idea also is that we hope that they're collaborating with other agencies because clearly there's going to be some overlap in their work.
Yeah, that sums it up. So they be liaisoning with MTA. Also, we put in our report that there needs to be some person who's dedicated to funding and grant management. So we would see that team also working closely with that individual as well.
Hey, Brian, I want to chime in on this one too, just briefly to kind of cheer that I'm really excited that Baltimore City is so serious about the role that buses play for its residents. As you mentioned in the intro, I've been at the Transportation Alliance for a long time, since 2008. And it really used to seem like the city DOT felt that buses were an MTA function and that was a state agency and it wasn't their purview. And there's a lot that the city controls. Of course, they run the circulator, but they also control the streets and the signals and the sidewalks and things that affect whether the MTA bus works well or not. And that matters tremendously to city residents. And this administration really gets it. Director Sharkey really gets it. And they see how critical of an asset that is for outcomes for their constituents. And I think that's really exciting.
Excellent. I think I'm unbiased when I say that Director Sharkey is doing an amazing job. There's a history of bike lash with new facilities, such as when Mayor Pugh removed the Roland Avenue cycle track and Mayor Young sliced out part of the new Monument Street bike lane to restore parking. With other new facilities moving forward, such as the Wolf and Washington Street facility, which I believe, Liz, you were referring to when you were talking about the engagement. And that facility is going to connect the waterfront and Clifton Park. How do you think the city can avoid similar outcomes with that reaction to new things that are being put forward?
I'm going to let other folks go first because I know this is sort of like Bike Moore's thing, but I would love to hear what other people's thoughts since I've been speaking a lot.
I mean, I think one thing is the idea that it's being put somewhere or being placed in a neighborhood as opposed to when you start the community engagement process and are they involved in from the beginning as opposed to, hey, you guys need a bike lane here and this is what we plan to do, what's your feedback? So I think really how you approach it from the beginning is critical. And also a lot of I think another angle, particularly for bike infrastructure and things that are related to traffic calming, is a lot of the things that we do that help bikes also help pedestrians. And I think when we be a little bit more general about some of the benefits of these things too, that's also another way of kind of reducing some of the bike lash per se.
I guess as a kind of follow-up question, when you're talking about that engagement being an important part and making people feel like they're part of the process as opposed to it being put on them, kind of circling back to that engagement question, like what do you think is the good way to do that engagement so that people do feel listened to and engage with the process?
I think first you have, sorry, I'll start and I'll jump. I know Liz has a lot she wants to say. I mean, I think first is listening to what the needs of the community are. And I think, sometimes you'll hear some needs that bikes actually do address the needs, but they may not know. For example, like a safe place for my kids to have an active space to go, or to be able to get to school safely, those sort of things. So I think if we can really tie the needs of this community to some of the projects that we are building, that's one way of kind of getting community buy-in. And Liz, I know you're itching.
Well, I'll just say one of the things that's been really interesting about COVID is just to see this explosion of people who bike. And I think one of the things that I think would be very helpful is to build community with folks that are already biking and allow folks that live in these neighborhoods to be that bridge builder, or hire them, pay them. You know what I mean? Like, we need to make sure that it stops being the one bike planner that doesn't have any relationships in the neighborhood. And it's not out of malice, it's just who has, they don't have capacity, right? It's just impossible to put that on one urban planner, right? So I think some of it is just rethinking community engagement and what it means. And I think also, like, yeah, so quit looking at this like thing as this fearful thing that nobody would want. That's absolutely not true. You look at Lake Montebello once it got closed off to cars, and it's massive. And when you hang out there and you chat with people, they're like, well, I'd like to bike other places in the city, I just don't feel safe. So the groundwork has been laid. I think the key is being thoughtful about the power dynamics, about how you're presenting it too. And so I think that goes back to this equity piece, like who actually has a stake and who actually gets to lead some of these conversations, and then who's getting the good stuff. You know what I mean? I think that was the other thing. Like, Maryland Avenue, I still believe had to be built where it was, because I think in order to sell protected facilities, you needed to see high usage right out of the gate. And so there's a lot of north-south traffic that happens with people kind of going from neighborhoods downtown. That said, we don't need, like, we're painting crappy bike lanes in every other neighborhood in the city and expecting people to want bike lanes. And so I think that's the other thing, is the city needs to be investing and making high quality stuff happen in other neighborhoods, and not just sort of being like, do you want a bike lane? I think it has to be, here's an entire network that's happening. Here are all these other investments we're making in pedestrian and transit access. And this is not something that we're imposing on people, but we have hired people that live all over the city that have unique knowledge that are champions of this stuff. So it's a lot, yeah. So anyway, there's a lot that could happen. And I think there's a lot that could happen even within the resources that exist within inside the Department of Transportation.
Excellent. I wish we could sit here and talk for another hour. Unfortunately, we are coming up to the end, and I want to respect all your time. We will be sticking around for a little bit just to chat and kind of socialize. So you guys are all welcome to stick around. But I did want to close with this question. Obviously, you guys worked on the transition report, so there's a whole list of things that are priorities. But I'm going to give you a choose your own question. Either what is an issue that hasn't bubbled up to our elected leaders and should be an issue in the coming years, or what is one of the things on the transition report that if you had complete control for one day, you could make happen tomorrow? And I'd like to have everybody take this one and to wrap us up.
I'm ready, Brian. So I'll jump in and give my colleagues here a chance to think if they want. Hopefully I'm not stepping on anybody's toes. One thing I was hoping you were going to ask us about, and this is a recommendation in the transition report. It's a recommendation for the first term. So as Dr. Chavis said, or Liz said, there's recommendations broken out by the first 100 days, the first year, and then the first term. So this is our first term one. And it's recommendation number 1, and it says work with regional partners to create a regional transit authority or equivalent. And where that's coming from is the desire to change the way we pay for and govern transit in the region. And that's something that a lot of advocates have been working on, and local governments have been looking at seriously, and legislators have been looking at seriously. And I've got to say, it's something that's been talked about for a long time, but I think the talk has gotten much more serious. And it's coming from the idea that the Baltimore region is the economic engine of the state. It's the population center of the state, but the way we pay for and govern public transportation is not producing good results. And as evidence of that, you can look to the fact that, getting around the region, it's difficult to transfer between systems. You can look at the fact that new capacity has not been added to the MTA's regional network since it double-tracked the light rail in 1997. a generation ago. You can look at the fact that the buses and trains break down more often than in peer transit systems in the US. You can look at the fact that ridership has fell for 5 years, fell by 25% or 20% over 5 years before the pandemic hit, or that vehicle miles per capita has been climbing, or that carbon emissions per capita has been climbing. We need to change these trends and do something better. So I'll plug, and maybe Eric, if you have it, you can drop the link in the chat, but Transit for Reform for Maryland is a report that came out at the end of 2020 by Brianne Eby and Paul Lewis of the Eno Center for Transportation. My organization, the Central Maryland Transportation Alliance, and the Greater Washington Partnership jointly commissioned that study. So check it out. It studies the issue, looks at peer regions, and makes some recommendations. And I also want you all to be aware that the Baltimore Regional Transportation Board has commissioned a study with a much bigger budget than we had for ours. They've hired Nelson Nygaard as the lead consultant, and that's due out in July. But they're providing monthly updates at the BRTB meetings about the different chapters of that report. And I highly recommend them. The presentation in January was really interesting about the history of sort of how we got to transit being governed the way it is. So that would be big structural change for the region and for the state. But I think it would put the region and the state on stronger footing to pay for the next generation of transit and have it produce better results. Thanks.
Go next. I think for me, this is using my researcher lens a little bit, but I think the part that I was most excited about was the stuff related to increasing accountability and transparency with government. In particular, when it comes to increased data and reporting related to transportation and adding more transportation related things to city stat, as well as looking at how we can ensure that the procurement rules and legislation are actually being adhered to, and ensuring that local residents are benefiting from these projects that we're building in the city. That would be mine.
I'm going to jump in so that Liz gets the last word, because whatever she says will be smarter than whatever I say. Yeah, I wasn't on with these guys on the transition team, so I'm not as familiar with the report. So I don't know if this is in there or not. I haven't read it yet. But one thing I think Brian and I have noticed over time with the Transportation Alliance is the city and even like the state and the surrounding counties not being like coordinated or prepared to go after federal funding opportunities. You know, there's all these discretionary grants that you can go after at USDOT or the modal administrations under USDOT. And sometimes it seems very like haphazard and last minute. And so I don't know if it's in the report, but I'd like to see something like with the city have some sort of team or something where they're kind of coordinated and have like a plan and a prioritized list of like, hey, this is what we're going to go after to get some of these like discretionary grants that you can get from the feds.
That is in the report. We talked a lot about the fact, I mean, this is real. We gave back that money from the red line, and we have a black mark on Baltimore City. We have to work very hard to be eligible for federal funding again. That's going to take a lot of political maneuvering. So and then having projects in the pipeline, I think, is key, right? So we're not just like scrambling at the last minute, but we have quality projects that are cross agency, and the city is willing to invest and send people to the meetings and come up with some of the money. So yes, I think that was really important, was sort of the figuring out how to not screw up grants. The last thing I will say is the Baltimore Greenway Trail Network. It did make it in. But one of the things that is not getting talked about, that project, is the amount of intention that's going into looking at this as both an economic development project and an equity project. And I think the connectivity piece is really important, and recognizing that each section of this 30-mile trail loop has a whole different a whole host of issues and challenges and opportunities that it presents. But overall, one of the things that was really interesting to me was about the Southeast section. The report came out, the Greater Washington Partnership and Rails to Trails helped produce, that talked about the economic impact. So we're all talking about that. What we aren't talking about is why we did that. We needed to know the economic impact so that we can come up with really good solutions to ensure that people that already live there still will have access to the trail and still will see themselves reflected in the neighborhood. Like, it is an asset for them. And then I think what was really interesting when we took Delegate Stephanie Smith and Delegate Regina Boyce on a bike tour of that section, we were talking about the nuances. I think there's a lot of nuance when people talk about gentrification and property value increasing. And Delegate Smith and Delegate Boyce were like, we need some of our constituents' property to increase. Wealth is very much tied to your home and the value of your home. And so this is not just a like gentrification and displacement conversation. So I think that's what I want to hear more of, right? I want to hear more of these nuanced conversations. I want to get people more educated about what are we talking about generational wealth? What are we talking about economic development? What are we talking about preventing displacement? And then also not just painting everything with a broad brush and really understanding that these economic tools are complicated. And so what I need is leadership to get out in front and say those things. Because what we don't want is people's concern to not be responded to in a way that it is deserved to be responded to. And then that political issue that happens when a bunch of people get concerned about displacement that may or may not even live there will kill the project. So I think we have a lot of work to do as a city to have those nuanced conversations, and that's going to take leadership. And that happens across the board with transit projects. And you look at all of these things when we make improvements and people are concerned about displacement. I think that is real, but it is also complicated. And I think Delegate Smith and Delegate Boyce just did a fantastic job of articulating that. And I hope that more lawmakers and leaders do that more publicly.
Dr. Chavis, Liz Cornish, Brian O'Malley, Eric Norton, thank you guys so much. This was absolutely amazing. Really enjoyed this. If any of you guys would like to stick around,
Yes,
we'll be sitting here chatting.
Listen, here's the funny. I want to ask Liz a question. The bike, see that window behind you in the video here? Can you get a bike through that? Is that a door or a window? Yeah.
Just a really big window.
I just want to say what we're talking about funding, same concept. And I would love to spend a second with you explaining how funding is done.
Yeah.
All right, now 7:15, I heard Brian say, pour a drink. It's a BYOB at 7:15, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah, so if anybody who wants to stick around, we'll just be kind of socializing. So yeah, thank you guys very much for your time. This was an absolutely amazing panel. So yeah, if you want to.
Brian, I think Eric Norton had a drink with it that had a lime in it. So he kind of started, I saw this drink he had, I saw him do this a couple of times in the lime. So you're busted, dude. You're busted. So,
I'm only going to say, all I'm going to do is that there was.
This is my equivalent. This is not Tito's.
Cool. All right. Well, I have to hop off, but I threw my social media stuff in the thing. And so you can always feel free to reach out that way on Twitter. And thank you so much for hosting me. So I hope people stick around and have a good time chatting. But I've got to hop off. Sorry. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
And as Brandy said, if you're not looking for a drink, it is definitely not required. But I'd love to hear some people's thoughts on the panel, because I know some people commented to me privately with some things. So what were your guys' favorite things about what were discussed?
Can I go first?
Sure.
Okay.
Go ahead. Yeah.
I'm just a vendor in a way, but I small talk it like that. I'm a rep with Road Safe Traffic, and it's a $1 billion company, soon to be a $1 billion company. And everything you guys are working on now, at some point you call us to buy something. Somewhere down the road, you all, what you're doing now plan-wise, I just wanted to offer, is there any help I can do, like sponsor stuff, do lunch and learns, teach you about, help educate what the coming things, because we have partnerships with all the smart work zone vendors, like everything from A to Z, you know, and so it's like, I don't want to do a lunch and learn and talk about Pop-Tarts when you guys are doing, you know, cheesesteaks. So it's difficult, and everybody realized with COVID, the funding died out and everything, but I been doing this for 20 years, and all your headaches that you're having now, I'm old. So the young guys, you guys are coming in. I'm an engineer, and I went to WVU, West Virginia. So you're probably going to take some points off the board for that, just because West Virginia. Anyhow,
feel free to reach out to us.
Listen, I guess if I could bring the circle around the barn, the horse around the barn quickly, I have access to some funding and money. And if you guys want money, tell me.
Yeah, feel free to reach out to Brandy, I guess.
I don't know how I'm supposed to break it in. And you know, also what you guys are doing right now with these calls, because you're brilliant potential Mensa, all of y'all Mensa, and given free time to do the groups. Your backgrounds are all so busy that when you call on someone common, they're looking at that instead of hearing the talk. You know, you guys, you know, you guys just split the atom in front of me tonight. so and I'm like, what? Did I miss it? Was this square root of 69? I'm like 8 something. Anyhow.
All right.
Yeah, I mean, I think also, if I can speak, if I'm allowed to, I think I've had this conversation with others, is having anyone who's interested in transportation, like whatever mode you're in, whatever expertise you're in, like, you know, you're providing the services and the expertise in that field, rad. So I always think it's great to have conversations with everyone.